Hello, good evening. Welcome back to another Trek Talk, where I'll be taking a look at one of the episodes from the original Star Trek series this week, taking a look at the Menagerie Part 1, which is episode 15 in production order. And of course, this is a pretty pivotal episode in a sense. The first part of the only two-parter in the original series, the only real kind of cliffhanger ending on the original series. And of course, one thing that makes this, or another thing that makes this episode stand out, of course, is that the original pilot, the cage, was repurposed to provide material for this episode. And as always, I'll be reading from Mark Cushman's book. These are the voyages for behind the scenes material. Now, this was written, or at least the framing sequence was written by Gene Roddenberry. Well, I guess In the Cage was as well. I should say they both were. And this episode is directed by Mark Daniels. So this was in the TV Guide listing for November 12th, 1966. In the first part of a two-part story, Spock inexplicably abducts a crippled Captain Pike, the Enterprise's former commander, locks the spaceship on a course for the only forbidden planet in the galaxy, and then turns himself in for court-martial. So again, another episode that's going to run or revolve around a courtroom drama, just like the previous one, Court Martial. Only this time it's going to be Spock's turn. And Cushman writes, it is learned that Pike had once been held in captivity by the mentally advanced Talosians, who penetrated the captain's thoughts and used his memories to create vivid hallucinations, forcing him to experience the most pleasurable and traumatic moments from his consciousness. As these images from Talos IV are received by the Enterprise, Kirk's problem is to discover the reason for his first officer's uncharacteristic actions and unravel the mystery of Pike's past. Roddenberry's sly agenda with the original story of the cage that forms the core of the Menagerie was a commentary on modern man's tendency to live vicariously through television and movies, as well as the erosion of the human spirit as a result of non-activity. His message, live and let live, not through others, but through one's own personal adventures. With the wraparound material, the envelope script, we were given a counterpoint, live and let die, honoring an individual's freedom to choose when, where, and how. The Menagerie constitutes an amazing and unparalleled creative work, most notably to the credit of writer-producer Gene Roddenberry, director Mark Daniels, and film editor Robert Swanson. With precious little time and resources, these three, with the support of the entire Star Trek team, pulled off a near miracle and created one of the series' most highly regarded episodes. If the primary element of any good story is to present a character with a problem, then the Menagerie gives us a conflict four times over. Spock and Kirk have conflict with one another and inner conflict with themselves, as do Vina and Pike in the story within a story. This one is about friendship and loyalty. It is also about the quality and dignity of life. Okay, so let's take a look at this ourselves. And I will say ahead of time, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the footage from the cage. I've already covered the cage on Trek Talk. So if you want my thoughts on that episode and the characters in that, I would say please take a look at that one because I'm not going to hash through all that again. All right, so the Enterprise arrives at Starbase 11. When asked why they were diverted from their course and came to the starbase, Kirk tells the base commander, Commodore Mendez, that they received a subspace message asking the Enterprise to alter course. Spock says that the message came from Captain Christopher Pike, the former commander of the Enterprise. However, Commodore Mendez insists that Pike couldn't have possibly sent such a message, and then reveals to Kirk, Spock, and McCoy that Pike was caught in an explosion and is now a complete invalid, kept alive by a life support system in a mechanical chair that he now inhabits. He can no longer move or speak and can only communicate by flashing a light. One flash meaning yes, and two flashes meaning no. Pike indicates that he doesn't want to. Pike indicates that he doesn't want to see them, but Spock asks to remain with Pike for a while, and Pike agrees. After Kirk and the others leave, Spock reveals that he has a plan that involves Pike. Pike signals no, but Spock insists on going through with this plan regardless of the consequences. In the Commodore's office, Kirk reviews the computer records and finds no evidence that a signal was sent to the Enterprise. The Commodore suggests that Spock may have faked the message, but Kirk rejects this notion, insisting that Spock would never do such a thing. Mendez calls the computer center and tells the tech working there to keep looking for anything that would explain the message that Spock claims he received. While he's working, Spock enters and then subdues one of the workers and begins tampering with the computer. In the Commodore's office, Kirk meets Mendez's assistant, Miss Piper, who says they haven't found anything that suggests a message was sent. Both Mendez and Piper insist that in his current state, it's impossible for Pike to have sent a message. Meanwhile, Spock alters the computer to send a false message to the Enterprise with new orders. On the bridge, Lieutenant Hansen receives the message, which says these new orders are top secret and are to be fed directly into the ship's computer. Hansen tells Uhura to contact Captain Kirk to confirm the orders. The computer tech catches Spock in the act, trying to send a false message, and tries to stop him. Spock subdues him and then sends a false message from Kirk confirming the order and that Spock will be arriving on the Enterprise soon and that he will answer any questions that they might have about the orders. Hello, Adega. Good to see you, man. Thank you for stopping by, as always. Okay. Where was I? Okay, Spock. Okay, so Spock then contacts the Enterprise and tells Hansen that the destination will be fed directly into the ship's computer, and that in effect the computer is going to fly the ship to its destination, and says that this information is confidential and not to be discussed with ship's personnel. Meanwhile, Kirk is observing Pike, who keeps flashing no repeatedly on his chair. Both Kirk and McCoy wonder what no could mean, and Kirk begins to wonder if it involves Spock in some way, if Spock may have lied about receiving the message. Spock states the old canard that Vulcans can't lie. I mean, we all know that ain't true, and insists that Spock wouldn't do such a thing. Then they received a message that there's a medical emergency on the Enterprise and McCoy is needed there. Mendez then shows Kirk his file on Talos IV, and they discuss General Order Number 1. Of course, it being the only rule or only law in Starfleet that carries a potential death penalty, as Talos is a forbidden planet, planet forbidden, you might say, and is not to be approached under any circumstances. Let's see. Kirk only says that he really just knows what everybody knows about it and doesn't know anything more than the general order, but he doesn't know why. And then Mendez reveals to him that the Enterprise went to Talos IV under the command of Pike, although it doesn't give any clear specifics on what happened there. Then they discover that Pike is missing from his quarters, and then they discover that the Enterprise is warping away and won't respond to their hails. And Kirk is like, "What the hell is going on?" As they're warping away, Uhura says they're receiving a hail, but Spock tells her not to respond. He then announces to the crew that Kirk has been assigned to temporary medical leave and that Spock has been placed in command of the Enterprise. McCoy arrives and questions Spock's orders, saying he was called to the Enterprise for an emergency, but there doesn't seem to be one, and no one seems to know anything. And he also doesn't know anything about Kirk needing medical leave because he was just with Kirk a little while ago. Spock then reveals to McCoy that Pike is on board the Enterprise, and he plays a message from Kirk, a fake message, telling McCoy to obey any orders that Spock gives him and not to question Pike about what's going on. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so on the bridge, Hansen informs Spock that a shuttlecraft is pursuing them, but Spock tells Hansen they will not change course to allow the shuttle to catch up or contact the shuttle in any way. And so we get the shuttle again after the Galileo 7, which was the first one to feature a shuttlecraft. Although in this one we see only they've done it up differently, so it says Starbase 11, but this is the same model. I think they only had one model. And the shuttle, of course, carries Kirk and Mendez. Eventually, the shuttle exhausts its fuel and can no longer return to the starbase, with Kirk noting that they only have 2 hours of oxygen left. They also realize that the Enterprise's course is taking it to Talos IV, and they wonder why Spock could be taking the Enterprise there. On the bridge, McCoy wonders very loudly about who could be following them in a shuttlecraft. Like, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Spock? Spock locks the tractor beam onto the shuttle and then orders Captain Kirk to be beamed aboard. He then calls security to the bridge and tells McCoy that he should be placed under arrest. He being Spock, that he himself should be placed under arrest for mutiny. Spock then reveals that the whole thing has been a ruse, and that he falsified the orders, taking them to their current destination. Spock has McCoy. McCoy has Spock confined to quarters. Kirk and Mendez beam aboard, and Kirk orders that they change course, but the computer is piloting the ship, and they can't get it to relinquish control. Because if I remember right, I believe somehow Spock had tied the navigational controls to the life support. And the only way to free up the controls was going to be to deactivate the navigational control or something like that. But if you did that, you'd shut off the life support. And the computer basically wouldn't let them do it. The computer's saying, no, 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 you can't shut off the life support. Let's see. Okay, now a hearing is convened to question Spock on his actions. Spock requests an immediate court martial, which Kirk denies, saying that they need 3 command rank officers to be present for a court martial. So we're getting a court martial for the second straight episode. But Spock notes that in addition to Kirk and Mendez, Captain Pike is on board as well. Kirk rejects this, noting that Pike is an invalid, being very ableist of him. But Spock notes that Pike is still on the active duty roster, and Mendez admits that Spock is right. They didn't have the heart to retire him medically. So technically, he is still on the active roster. As Mendez notes, whatever he's planning, he planned it well. So a court martial is convened, at which Spock pleads guilty. Mendez demands that Spock explain his actions, and Spock requests that the view screen be engaged to present evidence that will explain why he's taking Pike to Talos IV. The screen then plays, he shows them an episode of Star Trek. He plays footage from the cage. Um, Spock shows them how the Enterprise, under Spike's command, was lured to Talos IV by a false distress signal. Uh, they arrived on Talos IV, believing they had found the survivors of a ship that had crashed on Talos IV about 18 years earlier. However, the distress signal and the crew themselves were all actually powerful illusions created by the Talosians, who have formidable mental powers. Oh, and also they meet Vina, who is the daughter of one of the people on the crew. But eventually, the survivors are exposed as being illusions. They all vanish, and the Talosians abduct Pike, and they imprison him in a cage with the woman, Vina, with the purpose of repopulating their planet. Although, I mean, they don't know that initially. Now, then Uhura informs them that they are receiving transmissions from Talos IV explaining the images they're receiving. Then Uhura states they also received a message from Starfleet Command and that Kirk has been relieved of his command and that Commodore Mendez is to take command of the Enterprise effective immediately. And Mendez notes that not only has he pretty much condemned himself to death by defying General Order Number 1, but Spock has likely destroyed Kirk's career as well. Kirk confronts Spock, and Spock pleads with Jim or with Kirk to understand, saying, "Please understand, it's your career, but it's his life." And the episode ends there. Okay. So we'll go back to the book here. So on March 6th of 1966, Desilu received notification from NBC that the series had been sold and was given an order for 16 episodes. The studio heads took a few days to decide if they wanted to proceed with this costly venture. At the end of the week, with a go from Desilu, Roddenberry gave out the first 4 story assignments, which were Dagger of the Mind, The Corbomite Maneuver, The City on the Edge of Forever, and What Are Little Girls Made Of? Then, just days later, on March 14th, he sent a memo to Herb Solow suggesting that The Cage be incorporated into a 2-part episode, melding old footage with the cast and cast with the new one. He made the argument that this would not only save the studio money, but more importantly, would ensure that Star Trek would not fall behind in its production schedule and risk missing an air date. It was surprisingly early in the game for Roddenberry to be so sure that a move such as this would be needed. His real motivation for making the suggestion was to bring to the airwaves a work of which he was immensely proud. NBC had already agreed that Where No Man Had Gone Before, despite further cast changes since its filming, could be one of the 16 episodes. Now the network would consider letting The Cage be another. And hello and hail to the J Rocker. Hello, sir. Thank you for stopping by. Now, 2 days later, on March 16th, The Cage went off to Stan Robertson. Like the others at the network, he was impressed by its scope, with production values that far exceeded anything produced for television in the past. He was quick to embrace the idea. Even without a story outline to serve as a blueprint, NBC agreed to this unique proposal. The Cage could be used as one of the 16 episodes with 2 caveats. One, it would be combined with a companion story featuring the current cast, comprising close to 50% of the material to be seen in the 2-part episode. And 2, that the network would only pay for one of those episodes. NBC, after all, had already contributed a lot of money into the making of The Cage. Desilu, however, was not happy. If the studio went along with Roddenberry's proposal, it would be forfeiting $100,000 in revenue from the network. by losing that one episode they were producing, with the order for newly produced episodes decreasing from 15 to 14. On the other hand, if the companion episode, the envelope story, could be produced for the budget of a single new episode, the studio would save itself $92,000 in financing by not having to make that the 15th new episode. So, which would mean what a financial loss of about 8,000 altogether. It was an early victory for Roddenberry, and then the project was immediately put on the back burner. He had suddenly found himself far too busy rewriting scripts to make time for creating the needed envelope story, a teleplay which would certainly require intricate planning and structuring in order to properly utilize the bulk of the first pilot, while at the same time incorporating a new storyline worthy of a marriage with the old. He asked John D.F. Black to take on the headache as his second Star Trek writing assignment just as soon as he was finished rewriting Mudd's Women. Starting May 23, 1966, Black focused on finding a suitable structure for an envelope script that could solve the puzzle he'd been given. He ran his ideas past Roddenberry, then broke ground on the script, which was titled From the First Day to the Last, on Friday, May 27th. Spending the weekend roughing out the better part of the first draft, then abandoning it for an urgently needed rewrite on The Enemy Within, followed by rewriting a story outline, then 3 script drafts on The Naked Time. More work then followed for Black, with script polishing on The Man Trap, Balance of Terror, What Are Little Girls Made Of, Charlie X, Dagger of the Mind, and Miri, before he could turn his attention back to the envelope script. Now, having done the near impossible and in directing The Man Trap and The Naked Time combined in less than 12 days, with no prep time for the latter episode, Mark Daniels seemed the best choice for the directing chore, provided the envelope was written with economics in mind. Black delivered his first draft teleplay of From the First Day to the Last on August 12th. Just 2 days before his contract with Star Trek as associate producer and story consultant was due to run out. He had one last obligation to provide a script polish on this final assignment. But Roddenberry didn't give any notes to Black for his second original teleplay, nor did he ask for a rewrite. Instead, notification was sent out on August 17th that Black's assignment was to be cut off at the first draft. Roddenberry now had Gene Coon available, backed by Stephen Karabatzos, to handle the rewriting of scripts and the assigning of further story outlines, allowing him to take the time to do the envelope script himself, and he felt do it better than Black had done. While Roddenberry worked on the script, Robert Justman got a sinking feeling in his gut. On September 14th, he wrote to Ed Pearlstein at Desilu's legal department asking, quote, "Is there liable to be any hang-up with cast members that were used in the original pilot? Are we going to be able to use the original pilot as a two-parter in this series? Does Jeff Hunter's original contract allow for this sort of thing? Perhaps you ought to check it out with his agent. I don't want to have Gene write an envelope to make this pilot into a two-parter, have us shoot it, and then discover we can't use it." Remarkably, no one had even thought about that up until now, but then no one had ever done anything quite like this in television before. 7 days later, while Pearlstein was trying to work out the specifics concerning how the footage from the cage could be used, Roddenberry turned in his first draft teleplay for part 1 of The Menagerie, certain he had not borrowed from Black's script, at least not to any consequence. Pearlstein compared the two scripts and half agreed, making John Black an offer of $750 on September 28th, provided that he would sign a document stating that he had been fully compensated and that he had not been asked to do any work beyond the expected duties of the series' executive story consultant. Black's radar went up at this. Not trusting Roddenberry, he filed a complaint with the Writers Guild of America, which automatically mandated that the arbitration board compare the two scripts and come to a determination as to whether From the First Day to the Last or The Menagerie were in fact the one and the same, or that the latter was based on the former. Roddenberry continued working and on October 3rd had his second draft ready. He ran this version to the Mimeo department, which put it into yellow covers and sent it to the network and to DeForest Research for review. Let's see here. Now, as for the complaint that John D.F. Black made with the Writers Guild, he believed this original teleplay was proof enough on its own of the origin of the new story and did not bother to file a statement on his own behalf. Roddenberry did submit a statement. He said that the idea for the envelope episode was his alone, which was true, I believe. What little of Black's scene descriptions and dialogue which remained was a contribution made in accordance to his position as the executive story consultant. And as far as that part, well, I don't know. That seems to be more of a debatable point. The Guild compared the two scripts. With no statement from Black, there could be no dispute to Roddenberry's claims to have been the sole idea man. And since the approach to writing out those ideas was so different, as documented by two different scripts, the arbitration board ruled in favor of Roddenberry. Roddenberry believed the board decision was correct, saying, quote, I had the idea of Mr. Spock breaking with regulations and taking his former captain aboard the Enterprise, even against the wishes of that former captain. Then he would have to take command of the Enterprise in Kirk's absence, and that he would set course for the Forbidden World. That was mine. Black's complaint in 1966 and for over the 4 decades to follow has to do with his belief that the broad story points, what little the two scripts have in common, were his invention, not Roddenberry's. He said, quote, I never again trusted blindly in the process. I never again trusted that the truth would win out by itself. Okay, now to use the footage from the cage, a new deal had to be struck with the director and performers from that original pilot. The footage was, after all, being exploited in a context other than originally intended. Robert Butler, who directed the pilot, was offered the job of expanding it into a 2-part episode. He said, quote, Gene shelved the first pilot and wrote it as Enterprise history, what had happened with the craft with the previous commander and all that stuff. He called me and asked me if I wanted to direct the material around it so it would be a full 2 hours by me, and I said, no thanks, I've been there, good luck. Even 4 decades later, with the legendary status that Star Trek has achieved, Butler doesn't see much value in his work on the cage or the series it helped to launch. He said, quote, I just don't get it. To me, it's too preposterous, it's too clean, and it's too wordy. Now, Twilight Zone was preposterous and wordy, but it was in black and white, and it was a half hour. They're about the same size, aren't they, in terms of television history? Twilight Zone and Star Trek. And I can get Twilight Zone because they're just good yarns, but I honestly don't get Star Trek. People love it. I'm not going to argue that, but for my taste, it seems too square jawed, too heroic. I don't know. I'm mystified. So a deal was worked out where Butler took sole credit for the Menagerie Part 2 since the footage from the cage dominated that segment. Mark Daniels, hired to shoot the new footage, would receive sole credit for directing the Menagerie Part 1, which leaned more towards the new scenes. On October 18th, Ed Pearlstein wrote to Sidney Stanky at Desilu Business Affairs that he had closed a deal to pay Jeffrey Hunter $5,000, Majel Barrett $750, Peter Giurea $750, John Hoyt $750, and Adam Rourke, who played Chief Garrison, $600, in consideration for granting permission to allow their scenes from the cage to be used in the 2-part episode. But it wasn't until November 14th, after the end of production and just days before the broadcast of the Menagerie, that Pearlstein wrote to Stanky saying he had finally secured permission from the few holdouts: Meg Wiley, Clegg Hoyt, Ed Madden, George Schmidt, and Serena Sand, for an undisclosed amount. And he was still fighting with Leonard Nimoy, who wanted $12.50 for the use of his footage from the original pilot. The way Nimoy and his agent looked at it, the actor was getting cheated out of an episode, getting paid for only one new Star Trek instead of two. The way Desilu saw it, Nimoy had already been paid for the cage, therefore, he had already been paid for the first of the two episodes. Desilu was the winner in this round of what would become a growing Star Trek versus Nimoy saga. Malachi Throne, who had provided the voice of the Keeper in the cage, would now appear on screen as Starfleet Commander Jose Mendez. And let me go back. There he is. Throne had continued to gain status in Hollywood and at 37 was a guest star in Great Demand. Besides having previously worked with Shatner in the Outer Limits episode Cold Hands, Warm Heart, Throne had a recurring role in several episodes of Ben Casey and appearances on Rawhide, Mr. Novak, The Fugitive, and The Big Valley. The Big Valley! Within a few months of this, he appeared as a murderous double agent on I Spy, a madman obsessed with ruling the earth on the Wild Wild West, the ghost of Blackbeard the pirate on Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, the evil False Face on Batman, and the thief in The Thief from Outer Space on Lost in Space. Yeah, I remember on that Batman episode because he had a mask on the whole time, and in that episode, his name isn't given in the credits. It's like there's just a question mark, like question mark as false face. And I remember seeing a video on YouTube about that and why that happened, why his name wasn't given in the credit. I can't remember the reason though. I forget. And also, we should also point out he would return to Star Trek. He would be on Star Trek: The Next Generation in the two-parter reunification, where he'd reunite with Leonard Nimoy in that two-parter, where he would play the Romulan Senator Pardak, who betrays Spock. And also, another thing they don't mention here is he was on Babylon 5. He appeared in season 2 of Babylon 5. He played the Centauri Prime Minister. And he gets killed he's assassinated by Lord Rifa. Of his performance on Lost in Space, Throne said, "Oh, I loved that part. I was ever chewing up the scenery. Irwin Allen just let me do any piece of shtick that I wanted, and I did it all. It was fun landing those jobs and going from one show to another. As a performer, you felt worthwhile, that you were capable of shifting gears whenever it was called for. And there was little time for rehearsal, so you were working on your toes all the time. It's not the same thing as in the theater where you've had 3 or 4 weeks to come up with something. In TV, you had to come up with something right away. You just had to move right in." 1 year after his appearance here on Star Trek, Throne would land a co-starring role with Robert Wagner on the series It Takes a Thief, which was produced by Gene Coon. Julie Paris was cast as Miss Piper. She was 26 and had found a career in actor after winning a modeling contest in which the the judge was Jerry Lewis. Lewis subsequently cast Parrish in 2 of his early 60s films. Frequent work on television followed, including a part opposite Jeffrey Hunter in the pilot for his series Temple Houston. Hello, DJ Play Nice. Thanks for the thumbs up, sir. Appreciate it. Okay. Majel Barrett would have dual roles here as number 1 in the flashback and, of course, as the voice of the Enterprise computer. Hagen Beggs made his second and final appearance as helmsman Lieutenant Hansen, previously appearing in Court Martial. He is in operational command of the ship when Spock hijacks the Enterprise to Talos IV. Beggs said, quote, when talking to Roddenberry, he was a very easy guy to talk to. And he had a very nice eloquence about expressing this idea of his that things can be so different. Different from what was on television at the time and different from how many saw the future as possibly being. John D.F. Black was almost called back to active duty on Star Trek, not as associate producer or story consultant, but as an actor. His wife, Mary Black, said, Dorothy Fontana called and said that they had this really fun idea because John's eyes matched the eyes of Jeffrey Hunter, and they couldn't find another actor who had the right eyes. They were sure that John's did. They wanted him to come in and sit in the wheelchair and be Captain Pike with lots of makeup on. John Black said both of us immediately had the attitude that that wouldn't be very much fun, and I didn't hesitate in turning it down. Actor Sean Kinney was 24 and new to TV when offered the chance to sit in for the former Enterprise captain. Kinney had auditioned for casting director Joe Agosta, and then 1 week later was called back to Desilu to meet with Roddenberry. I wonder what kind of audition that was to play Pike. Okay, sit there. Okay, that's great. Thanks. We'll call your people. It was 1 week later when he was called back to Desilu to meet with Roddenberry. For his memoir, Captain Pike Found Alive, Kinney wrote, quote, I sat facing his desk and noticed my casting photo was lying there. At first, Gene talked about the show's concept and the fact that he had been looking for a lead actor to play the role of a former starship captain. As I sat down, Gene got up and walked around me holding my casting photo in his hand. Continuing, he said that the lead character, Pike, had been severely injured in a training accident and was unable to speak or move any body parts. Roddenberry explained to Kinney that he would only be able to communicate to the other actors and the camera by beeping. And Kinney remembered thinking, so I'm the lead actor, but I have no lines and all I do is beep. Okay. Roddenberry continued, you have a strong resemblance to an actor named Jeffrey Hunter, who is unfortunately filming a movie in Spain and is not available for the role. You're sure you don't have any allergies to latex, which will be used extensively on your face. It'll be the same makeup reconstructed every day for at least a week. Kinney added, if Gene Roddenberry had said, and we're going to starve you for those 8 days, I would have still said, sure, no problem. Later on the set, I actually felt like I was being starved. I had to eat all of my meals through a straw due to the heavy makeup restrictions. However, Kinney would be rewarded for his suffering and would return to Star Trek to play Lieutenant DePaul in Arena and in A Taste for Armageddon. Kinney elaborated further. Being a guest star on a show with no lines and unable to speak to any of the actors and crew, due to all the makeup I was wearing, had an interesting twist to it. After a few hours and not adding to anyone's conversation, you become a keen listener, and you also become almost like a piece of furniture, like a part of the set. You become invisible. And then you start to note interesting anecdotes coming out of certain people, and you develop a keen insight into what's going on around you. And I got quite an earful. I soon realized that, yes, Bill Shatner was not well liked, and in fact, he was disliked on set. But then again, his role was the captain of the ship, and he took his role very seriously on and off the set. I didn't have any personal confrontations with him, but he was known to thoroughly chafe the various directors on the show during filming. Shatner was a trained stage actor, and he used his powerful voice effectively to bark out orders at people. And I didn't even show. I don't know if I really have a good one of Kenny here. I should have shown him. I guess that's in the other one. Yeah, here we go. And it's you wouldn't think looking at him that he's 24. I think they did a pretty good job with the makeup. Malachi Throne, taking it all in, said it was hard to get a smile out of Leonard when he was in character. Of course, with Leonard, it's hard to get a smile out of him anyway. He does have a sense of humor and a good one at that, but when he works, he is very serious. Leonard really was Spock. Now, Shatner was the opposite, and I'm sure that that was a relief from the severity of his character. Bill was fun, but he was also forthright and adamant about everything because that was his character. And poor Sean was stuck in that chair for hours. Kinney recalled, on the last day of the shoot, Roddenberry came up to me and congratulated me for my terrific emoting job. Then he surprised me by offering me a recurring role as Lieutenant DePaul, the ship's helmsman. And that's when DePaul was born. He said that I had put up with a lot and he wanted to reward my tenacity and good spirit. Okay. So, the Menagerie Part 1 aired on November 17th, 1966. It was Thanksgiving, actually. And the first half hour was second in the ratings behind The Dating Game. And then the second half hour was also second, barely beating out Bewitched. In the very immediate future, the Menagerie Part 1 and 2 combined together to create a feature length production and was nominated for the Hugo Award in the category of Best Science Fiction Presentation for the year of 1966. Among its competition were two other Star Trek episodes. Hagen Beggs recalled, Gene brought me into his office after we finished shooting and said, everything is fine with your work, but I'm making a change in the helmsman. I think I need to spread this out a bit more. So thank you very much, but I want to try and make it bigger. I think it's got great possibilities. I said, okay, and went on to do some other shows, and I didn't think much about it. But it wasn't until a few days later, or years later, when the show was gaining renewed popularity in reruns, that I even thought I should put it back on my resume as being involved. I'd always felt slightly embarrassed about it because I'm thinking, I'm literally sitting at a board pushing buttons and people are giving me this great credit for being on the show. Yes, I did take the captain's chair at one point, but didn't see my part as being important. In time, I became awakened to how popular this show was and how much it's meant to so many people. Hold on just a moment, please. Hold on. Okay. Where it has all gone is totally amazing. It's by default that I'm luckily in this iconic grouping, and it was simply honest to God by just being there at the right time. Sean Kinney said, it was a thrill to be in the show. It was my first film job, and I received top billing in the credits. It took them almost 5 hours to apply the makeup daily, so I guess they figured top feature credit was the least they could do to compensate for all the restructuring to my anatomy and reward my patience. In another interview, 44 years after playing the crippled Pike, Kinney said, I think the Menagerie was so ahead of its time. I'm proud of it because the story said so much and it was taken so emotionally by so many people. Here was a guy, Captain Pike, who is almost the first physically challenged person anyone saw on TV in a major part. He was in a wheelchair and couldn't even talk. I meet people now in wheelchairs who roll up to me and say, when I saw that show, I thought, what if I lost my voice? I've only lost my legs. It could be so much worse. It was really a profound episode and touched so many people. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I will do the second part of the menagerie next week. And I'll give this episode, I guess, an A minus. It's certainly an important episode in Star Trek, and I think it holds up quite well. So I'll be back for the Menagerie Part 2 next week. And until then, I hope everyone has a good evening, and I'll see you then.